The year is 1942. The night shift at the Willow Run bomber plant is a universe of blinding light and deafening sound. Arc welders throw showers of sparks, a rain of fire against the dark skeletal ribs of a B-24 Liberator. The percussive thunder of 10,000 rivet guns hammering in unison is the heartbeat of a nation at war. Every 60 minutes, another one of these four-engine giants, a testament to American will, rolls off a mile-long assembly line. Down at the shipyards, from Baltimore to Richmond, California, the story repeats itself. A Liberty ship, its hull plates still warm, slides down the ways into the water, sometimes before the paint has even had a chance to dry. This is the arsenal of democracy, roaring to life. But this spectacle of production was born from desperation. Just 2 years earlier, in 1940, the world stood on a knife edge. The Nazi war machine had stormed across Europe, and Britain stood alone, battered and bleeding. From the mid-Atlantic, the news was grim. Convoys carrying vital supplies were being hunted relentlessly by German U-boat wolf packs, sending men, machines, and hope to the bottom of the cold, dark ocean. The United States, still clinging to a fragile peace, was a nation of consumers, a country that built refrigerators and radios, not tanks and bombers. The central staggering question was this: how could a nation so thoroughly unprepared, so dedicated to peacetime comforts, pivot fast enough to not just fight, but to outproduce the combined might of Germany, Japan, and Italy? The task seemed impossible. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared that America must become the great arsenal of democracy, many scoffed. His audacious plan, Lend Lease, promised to supply the Allies with the tools to finish the job, but the promise fell hollow. America didn't have the tools. Isolationists argued it wasn't our fight. Industry titans, the masters of mass production, said it couldn't be done. You don't build a complex aircraft, they argued, the same way you build a Ford sedan. Yet, the gears began to turn, slowly at first, then with unstoppable momentum. Washington created new levers of power: the War Production Board to direct the flow of every ounce of steel and rubber, cost-plus contracts that guaranteed profits and incentivized rapid expansion, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which poured billions into building the factories that would win the war. The nation's industrial heartland, the Auto Belt of Michigan and the Midwest, became the hinge upon which the fate of the free world would turn. The numbers that would eventually emerge are difficult to comprehend even today. By the war's end, American factories had churned out nearly 300,000 aircraft, more than all the Axis powers combined. They built over 2,700 of those hastily made but indispensable Liberty ships. The scale is monumental, but the story is human. It's in the aching hands of a riveter, her muscles screaming after a 12-hour shift. It's in the worried eyes of a foreman, his gaze fixed on the clock, knowing every minute lost could mean a life lost overseas. It's in the crackle of a family radio, carrying news from the front lines into a quiet living room, a constant chilling reminder of the stakes. The promise made in Washington was one thing, but making it real was another. The blueprints, filled with hope and ambition, were finally coming off the drafting tables. They were landing on the grimy, oil-stained floors of factories across the country, in the hands of men and women who had been building cars and washing machines just months before. Everything had to change. What transformations were needed inside the machines themselves, in the minds of the managers, and in the very spirit of the workers to turn this audacious industrial gamble into a world-altering miracle? So how did they do it? How did a nation of car makers, refrigerator builders, and toy manufacturers turn into the world's armory? It wasn't just a switch you flip. It was a painful, grinding process of unlearning. Take Henry Ford's Willow Run plant. Ford boasted he'd build a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. But an airplane isn't a Model T. The tolerances are tighter, the materials are alien, and the complexity is staggering. Early on, Willow Run was a mess. Parts didn't fit. Workers accustomed to simple, repetitive tasks were lost. It was a lesson learned in real time. You can't just apply auto industry thinking to aviation. The real revolution wasn't the assembly line itself, but what made the line work. The jigs, the fixtures, the gauges. These were the unsung heroes. Tools that held a complex wing section in precisely the right position so a newly trained worker could drill a hole with thousandth of an inch accuracy, over and over again. It was a revolution in workflow, breaking down a monstrously complex task into thousands of simple, repeatable steps. You could see the contrast everywhere. Visit a Pratt & Whitney or a Wright engine plant. It was like a watchmaker's workshop scaled to the size of a city. The air hummed with precision grinders and lathes, crafting pistons and crankshafts with surgical accuracy. Then, go to the Detroit Tank Arsenal, run by Chrysler. It was brute force on an epic scale. The roar was deafening as they churned out M3 and then M4 Sherman tanks, welding massive plates of steel together. Different products, different philosophies, but the same underlying principle, mass production tailored to the task. And behind all of it, the machine tool industry. The companies that built the lathes, the mills, the presses. They were the multiplier, the industry that built the industries. For every new tank or plane factory, another factory had to build the machines to fill it first. They were the quiet engine driving the entire war effort. Then, just as the engines were starting to roar, the wheels threatened to fall off. In early 1942, the Japanese swept through Southeast Asia, and overnight, America lost 90% of its natural rubber supply. No rubber meant no tires for trucks, no seals for engines, no wiring insulation. It was a potential knockout blow. The response was a frantic nationwide scramble. A crash program for synthetic rubber was launched, building massive complex chemical plants in record time. Simultaneously, to move the crude oil needed to run it all and to bypass the U-boat-infested Atlantic, they built the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines. 24 inches and 20 inches in diameter, respectively, stretching over 1,000 miles from Texas to the East Coast. They were lifelines built with blistering speed, keeping the entire war machine from grinding to a halt. You could feel the tempo shift across the country. 24/7 shifts became the norm. The lights never went out. A new language entered the factory floor, the language of the learning curve. Managers obsessed over the math. How many hours to build the 10th plane versus the 100th? How do we cut that time in half again for the 1000th? Fewer hours per unit, faster cycle times, fewer rejects on the inspection line. It was a relentless race against the clock, fueled by coffee and patriotism. And bridging the gap between the scientist's lab and the factory floor was the Office of Scientific Research and Development. They didn't just invent wonder weapons. They helped design them to be built. They'd take a new radar set, a revolutionary proximity fuse, or a stronger aluminum alloy, and work with engineers to make sure it could be mass-produced by a workforce that, just months before, might have been selling insurance or farming. Technology was worthless if you couldn't build it by the tens of thousands. The output numbers were staggering, climbing month after month. The graphs all pointed up. But inside the factories and on the planning boards in Washington, a new kind of anxiety was setting in. The machine was running so fast it was threatening to tear itself apart. You can build all the tanks in the world, but they're useless without trained crews to man them and ships to carry them overseas. You can design the most advanced bomber, but you need pilots to fly it and ground crews to maintain it. The bottlenecks were no longer in factory floor space or machine tools. The constraints were becoming human and logistical. For every victory on the production line, a new shortage appeared somewhere else. By late 1942, the arsenal was awake and producing miracles. But it was also beginning to feel the strain, facing critical shortages of both hands and hulls. The roar of the machine was a new kind of national anthem. In factories humming around the clock, America was building its arsenal, and the engine wasn't just steel, it was people. Millions of them. It was the woman they'd later call Rosie the Riveter, her hands, once familiar with kitchen dough, now learning the cold, precise language of a micrometer. By day, she'd read blueprints and pull levers. By night, she'd rock her child to sleep, the scent of cutting oil still faint on her clothes. In places like Henry Kaiser's Shipyards in California, a revolutionary idea took root. If women were to build the ships, someone had to care for their children. So on-site childcare centers sprang up, along with health clinics for the workers. It was a radical experiment in social support, born of necessity that would eventually blossom into the healthcare giant, Kaiser Permanente. But this great mobilization wasn't just about gender, it was about geography and race. A massive internal migration, the Great Migration, was reshaping the country. African American families from the rural South packed their lives into suitcases and boarded night trains, chasing rumors of jobs and a different kind of life in the industrial heartlands of Detroit, Richmond, and Oakland. They brought with them immense skill, ambition, and hope. But what they found was a complicated promise. The factory gates might have opened, that the city was often a maze of segregated housing, hostile neighbors, and deep-seated discrimination on the factory floor itself. The best jobs, the highest pay, were often reserved for white workers. Change didn't come easily. It had to be demanded. Labor leader Philip Randolph threatened a massive march on Washington, a bold move that forced President Roosevelt's hand. The result was the Fair Employment Practices Committee, an executive order designed to ban discriminatory hiring in defense industries. It was an imperfect tool, often underfunded and resisted, but it was a start. It was pressure, applied at a critical moment, that cracked open doors that had been sealed shut for generations. The factory floor was a pressure cooker of its own. Unions had made a no-strike pledge for the duration of the war, a patriotic promise to keep production moving. But patriotism couldn't erase all grievances. When the pace became relentless and safety was sacrificed for speed, tensions boiled over. Wildcat strikes, unauthorized work stoppages flared up, a raw expression of frustration from workers pushed to their absolute limit. The foreman's board, posting daily quotas like a general issuing battle orders, was a constant reminder that this was a war of production and they were the infantry. This all-in effort extended far beyond the factory walls. It reached into every kitchen, every backyard. Freedom, it turned out, required a new kind of discipline. Ration books dictated how much sugar, meat, and gasoline a family could buy. Driving was a luxury and pleasure trips were frowned upon. The nation's diet changed, not by choice, but by necessity. To fill the gaps, people turned to their own soil. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards, city parks, and schoolyards, a nationwide effort to grow their own food and free up commercial produce for the troops. The entire country was on a war footing. Children collected scrap metal and rubber. Housewives saved cooking grease, a key ingredient for explosives. Everyone bought war bonds, lending their savings to the government, a direct investment in the fight. Blackout drills and civil defense volunteers scanning the skies for enemy planes brought the distant war right to their doorsteps. It was a shared bargain, a collective sacrifice. You could feel it in the pre-dawn chill, waiting for a crowded bus, lunch pail in hand. You could smell it in the air, a mix of sweat, steel, and purpose. It was a complex brew of emotions. Pride in the work, exhaustion in the bones, resentment at the injustices, but all of it held together by a powerful, unifying sense of purpose. They were building miracles. Mountains of tanks, planes, and shells rose from the assembly lines, a testament to what a united people could achieve. But these miracles of production were useless if they remained on the docks. They had to cross an ocean haunted by German U-boats, the silent hunters of the Atlantic. The fruits of all this labor, all this sacrifice, were stacked to the rafters in warehouses, waiting for the steel hulls of the Liberty ships, the very ships these workers were building, to carry them into the storm. The old rules of shipbuilding were torn up and thrown away. Instead of building a ship from the keel up in one spot, a slow, painstaking process, Henry Kaiser's shipyards turned it into a symphony of mass production. They built massive, prefabricated sections, the bow here, the engine room there, a deck house over there, all at the same time. These modules, weighing hundreds of tons, were then lifted by giant cranes and welded together. Welding, faster and stronger than the old method of riveting, stitched the steel plates into a single, seamless hull. The entire shipyard was choreographed like a ballet. As one hull slid into the water, the keel for the next was already being laid in its place. This relentless efficiency shattered every record. The pinnacle was the SS Robert E. Peary, a Liberty ship built from start to finish in an unbelievable 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. A floating 10,000-ton cargo vessel, assembled faster than you can build a house. This flood of ships was lifeblood, but the Atlantic was a hunting ground. The war at sea became a grim, pulsating rhythm of hunter and hunted. To protect the convoys, a new kind of warship was born, the destroyer escort. Smaller, cheaper, and faster to build than a full destroyer, hundreds of them rolled off the slipways. They were armed with new weapons like the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that exploded on contact, giving U-boats no time to escape. Even more revolutionary were the escort carriers. Built on the hulls of merchant ships, these jeep carriers provided vital air cover in the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based planes couldn't reach. Combined with breakthroughs in radar that could spot a periscope at night, and Allied codebreakers reading Germany's encrypted naval messages, The tide turned decisively in 1943. The U-boat menace was broken. The sheer scale of what followed is almost impossible to grasp. It wasn't just a few ships, it was a torrent. Over 4,600 merchant vessels. Nearly 6,500 landing craft, including the legendary LST's landing ship. 10 enormous vessels with massive bow doors that could run right onto a beach and disgorge tanks and trucks, turning a hostile shore into an instant port. More than 500 destroyer escorts and 122 escort carriers joined the fleet. The numbers feel abstract, but they represent a physical reality that overwhelmed the Axis. This industrial wave was not just American. It was a combined Allied effort, but the sheer productive power of the United States was the engine driving it all. And what did these ships carry? Everything. The sinews of modern war. For the Soviet Union, fighting for its life on the Eastern Front, came thousands of locomotives and countless miles of railway tracks to rebuild their shattered transport network. Hundreds of thousands of American trucks, Studebakers, Jeeps, GMCs, gave the Red Army the mobility it had desperately lacked. Millions of tires, tons of canned meat, and mountains of raw materials flowed across the perilous Arctic convoys. Later, after the Normandy landings, this logistical miracle took a new form. The Red Ball Express, a non-stop 24/7 truck convoy system looping through France, rushing fuel, ammunition, and food to Patton's tanks as they raced toward Germany. Meanwhile, ingenious pipelines were laid across the English Channel, pumping aviation gasoline directly from British ports to airfields on the continent, feeding the insatiable thirst of Allied air power. For the Axis, the story was the reverse, a slow, agonizing starvation. In Germany, Albert Speer's rationalization of industry produced a temporary surge in production on paper. But it was a hollow victory. Allied bombers systematically targeted Germany's synthetic oil plants. And by late 1944, the Luftwaffe was grounded not for a lack of planes, but a lack of fuel. The transportation network fractured under constant air attack. Forced labor from conquered nations could not fix the fundamental shortages of coal, chemicals, and specialized steel. In the Pacific, the United States Navy waged a devastatingly effective submarine campaign against Japan. American subs equipped with superior radar and torpedoes systematically hunted and sank Japan's merchant fleet. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, freighters with rubber and iron ore all were sent to the bottom. Japan's industry, utterly dependent on these sea lanes, began to wither. Its factories fell silent, starved of the resources needed to fight. By 1944, the Allied war machine had reached its terrifying peak. Production, shipping, and combat doctrine had finally locked together into a single, unstoppable force. The sheer quantity of material was staggering, a physical manifestation of industrial power that no opponent could match. But something else was happening. The relentless tempo, the overwhelming mass, the ability to deliver anything, anywhere, at any time. It felt as if the Allies weren't just fighting with more equipment. They were fighting with a different concept of time itself. The clock was now on their side, and it was ticking faster than ever. By 1944, the outcome of the war wasn't just a matter of strategy, but of simple, crushing arithmetic. For those on the receiving end, it must have felt like a force of nature. The skies over Europe were layered with B-17s and B-24s, stacked in formations that blotted out the sun. Far across the Pacific, new B-29 superfortresses were reaching the Japanese home islands, flying higher and faster than anything that could touch them. At sea, Allied fleets were no longer just fleets. They were oceans of gray hulls stretching from one horizon to the other. On land, the Red Ball Express and other truck convoys uncoiled across France, a seemingly infinite river of steel, rubber, and gasoline feeding the advance. This wasn't just production for production's sake. Every bolt, every rivet had a direct battlefield consequence. The D-Day landings, the largest amphibious invasion in history, were only possible because of the incredible Mulberry Harbor's entire ports built in Britain, floated across the channel and assembled under fire. It was made possible by an armada of landing ship tanks, the LSTs, ugly, functional, and churned out by the hundreds from shipyards on inland rivers, thousands of miles from any ocean. When the German army launched its last desperate gamble in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, their panzer divisions didn't run out of courage, they ran out of gas. They were stopped not just by determined soldiers but by empty fuel dumps. A failure of logistics against an enemy who could airdrop supplies by the ton. In the Atlantic, the U-boat menace, which had nearly starved Britain, was hunted to extinction. Why? Because American and British shipyards were replacing escort carriers and destroyers faster than the wolf packs could sink them. The math had become brutally simple. Let's put this in perspective. By the war's end, the United States by itself had outproduced all the Axis powers combined in both value and volume. We're talking about staggering numbers. Nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, over 2 million military trucks. Merchant ships were built so fast that by 1943, a new Liberty ship was being launched, on average, every single day. We mass-produced artillery, ammunition, food, and medicine on a scale that defies imagination. How was this possible? It was a uniquely American formula. We married immense natural resources and cheap energy to the genius of standardized design and mass production. We unleashed the power of machine tools, scientific management, and a financial system that rewarded speed above all else. But the most critical ingredient was people. A total social mobilization drew millions of men and women from every corner of the nation, filling every factory shift 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was a democracy arming itself. Then, in the summer of 1945, almost overnight, it stopped. The factory whistles fell silent. War contracts were cancelled. Millions of workers, Rosie the riveters, welders from the heartland, draftsmen, engineers punched the clock one last time and stepped out into the daylight. They were tired, they were proud, and they were forever changed. It wasn't a perfect effort. It had its costs, its injustices, and its profound contradictions. But it left an undeniable legacy. It proved that a free society, when pushed to the brink, could turn mass production itself into a decisive weapon of grand strategy. In the end, this wasn't just a miracle of machines. It was a miracle made by human hands. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey through the arsenal of democracy. If you want to uncover more of the incredible, untold stories of World War II, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.